Karl Denke was a quiet, unassuming figure in the small town of Münsterberg in what was then Lower Silesia, Germany. Known to his neighbors as Papa Denke, he was often described as a soft-spoken, kind-hearted man who embodied the simplicity of rural life. To his neighbors, he was reliable and harmless, a man they often saw in church, a figure who attended to his modest household chores and kept to himself. No one in the tight-knit community would have suspected what lay beneath this mask of ordinary kindness. Denke was born in 1870 and had a difficult childhood, marked by both loss and isolation. His parents had died when he was young, and after inheriting the family farm, Denke eventually lost it. With no real skills or connections, he drifted through life, scraping by on odd jobs and finally finding his way to Münsterberg. His neighbors noted that he was frugal and quiet, only speaking when spoken to, though he would occasionally share stories from his younger days. Yet, for all his simplicity, he maintained a peculiar generosity. Denke was known to offer food and shelter to those who had fallen on hard times, giving lodgings to travelers and strangers. These gestures cemented his reputation as a kind, charitable figure. Yet, strangely, those who accepted his kindness were rarely seen again. By the early 1920s, stories had begun to emerge, mostly among those passing through town, of men who had vanished without a trace. These tales were whispered but largely dismissed by the townspeople, who had no reason to believe that anyone from their own ranks could be responsible. Denke's apparent generosity made him almost invisible, an individual who lived on the edges of Münsterberg society, blending seamlessly into its routines. So, when a blood-soaked man stumbled out of Denke's house one December day in 1924, crying for help and claiming he had barely escaped with his life, the townsfolk were shocked to learn that this local fixture, the gentle, charitable Papa Denke, was accused of a violent act. In a panic, the man had run through the streets, clutching a gash in his neck and yelling that Denke had tried to kill him with a hatchet. The man, who had been a traveler passing through town, had accepted Denke's offer of food and shelter only to find himself the target of a brutal assault. Denke had locked the doors and, without warning, attacked him. Bleeding and desperate, the man fought back and managed to escape, though barely. The police were called to investigate. They were reluctant, even skeptical. After all, Papa Denke was known as a harmless man. When they arrived at his modest house on Teichstrasse, they expected nothing more than a misunderstanding. But as they entered Denke's home, a pungent, sickly odor filled their noses, turning their stomachs. It was a smell that was familiar to them, yet unsettling in the context of a civilian's home. What they found as they continued their search would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The first sign of horror was inside a room in Denke's home where officers found barrels filled with brine and human flesh. The realization was slow, but sickening. Each barrel contained what seemed to be cuts of meat, carefully prepared and preserved. The officers were horrified as they identified the source of the pork Denke had been selling at the local market. These jars and barrels, they realized, were not preserving pork. They were holding human remains. Every part of the home seemed to conceal another horror. Bones were scattered around, some even polished, stacked like a butcher's wares. The sight grew even more grisly as they uncovered bags filled with hair and various tools, seemingly crafted from human bones and skin. Many of the jars contained pickled meat that, by its appearance, was unmistakably human, preserved in ways that suggested careful planning and a dark expertise. For years, Denke had been butchering people in his own home and, horrifically, selling their flesh as food. The quiet, kindly man had been supplying his own neighbors with the remains of his victims. The townspeople were horrified as rumors spread that they may have eaten the flesh of Denke's victims. Those who had shared a meal with him or bought his meat felt an unsettling sickness at the thought of what they might have unknowingly consumed. Denke had even given meat as charity, particularly to those who were poor or in need, his strange, twisted version of generosity. As they delved deeper into Denke's life, investigators uncovered ledgers meticulously kept by him. These records were as cold and precise as his crimes. Each victim was logged with their name, age, physical measurements, and sometimes other details, all noted in Denke's careful hand. This ledger spanned several years, suggesting that Denke's killing spree was not a sudden impulse, but a methodical, premeditated way of life. He seemed to view his victims not as people but as resources to be harvested, objects whose flesh could be sold, whose bones and skin could be repurposed. There was no remorse or humanity in his records, only calculations and measurements. One officer, unable to process the horror, described it as something out of a nightmare. To have interacted with this man who appeared so ordinary, so generous, and learned that he had hidden such monstrous secrets, it was almost incomprehensible. As the investigation continued, Denke's strange detachment became apparent. When questioned, he showed no signs of remorse. He did not attempt to defend himself or offer an explanation. In fact, he seemed almost indifferent to the charges against him, as if the realization of his own atrocities hadn't yet reached him, or perhaps never would. Instead, he sat quietly in his cell, a figure of disturbing calm amid a world reeling from the revelation of his crimes. The few things he did say during his brief time in custody only deepened the mystery. When asked why he had killed so many people, Denke responded with an eerie simplicity, as though he didn't understand the severity of his actions. His lack of guilt or regret made him more terrifying, as if he had rationalized his actions to a degree that allowed him to live with himself. To the investigators, he seemed more like a man who had built a twisted world for himself, one where his brutal actions were somehow logical or necessary. Only days after his arrest on December 22, 1924, Denke took his own life, hanging himself in his cell with a handkerchief. He left no note, no explanation for his actions, no confession or apology. His death left Münsterberg shocked and grieving, grappling with the dark legacy of the man they had once trusted. It was a death as quiet as his life, but his crimes would leave scars on the town that would never fade. In the weeks following his death, stories emerged about the strange pork Denke had sold to the townspeople. Neighbors whispered about the pickled meats he would share as gifts, his supposedly charitable offerings to those who were struggling. Those who had accepted his food or hospitality were now horrified, racked with a feeling of nausea as they wondered if they too had unwittingly partaken in his atrocities. The question gnawed at the townspeople, an unspeakable horror that crept into their daily lives. But even as Münsterberg reeled, questions lingered. Why had Denke killed so many? Why had he gone to such great lengths to preserve their remains, to catalog their details so meticulously? These questions had no answers. The meticulous records hinted at a mind that was chillingly organized, calculating and devoid of empathy. Yet the motivations behind his actions, his complete lack of guilt, his ability to live among the townsfolk as a trusted friend and neighbor, all of it defied easy explanation. Denke had been able to carry out his grisly work for years, undetected and unsuspected, a dark figure hiding in plain sight. The fact that no one had questioned him, that he was even trusted and liked, lent his story a haunting quality. It was a reminder that evil could wear a kindly face, that monsters did not always appear monstrous. Denke had fooled them all with his unassuming demeanor, using their trust to feed his horrific enterprise. The legacy of Karl Denke remains a chilling story, one that haunts the collective memory of Münsterberg to this day. His small house on Teichstrasse, now demolished, has faded into obscurity, but his name and his crimes live on, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most ordinary lives. For those who had known him, the revelations shattered their trust in their own instincts, leaving them with the unsettling knowledge that they had lived side by side with a monster. Denke's story serves as a dark reminder that evil can often hide behind the mask of a friend, a neighbor, a helpful figure. His ability to evade suspicion, to live quietly and unremarkably while committing unspeakable crimes, remains one of the most chilling aspects of his legacy. Even now, nearly a century later, the townsfolk of Münsterberg continue to pass down the tale of Karl Denke, a cautionary story that warns of the dangers of misplaced trust and the shadows that can sometimes lurk behind familiar faces.